J.R.R. Tolkien is the greatest writer in the history of the fantasy genre. Full stop. Alright, great video everyone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my page. Jokes aside, I have been really nervous about this video. I do a lot of analysis on a lot of different fantasy books, but none of them were written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Not only is it possibly the most detailed world ever created for a fantasy series, there are professors whose entire focus is Tolkien's works, even just specific areas of Tolkien's works. There is no margin for error when you're talking about Middle-earth. For close to a century, no other fantasy series has come close to the popularity of the world that he has created. All of that being said, I love Lord of the Rings, I love The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, everything that J.R.R. Tolkien has ever done, and there was no way I was going to avoid talking about his work. So thanks for watching, and here goes. J.R.R. Tolkien is sometimes called the creator of the high fantasy genre, which is only inaccurate in that we created the term to more accurately describe what he had created after the fact. High fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy that exists in a different world that tells an epic story, which makes sense when you contextualize Tolkien as an expert and fan of Germanic epic poems. So much of our conception of fantasy comes from Tolkien's Middle-earth, so I wanted to make two videos to discuss two of his major influences. In order to understand the how and why of these influences, we first have to understand Tolkien as a person. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in 1892 in what is now South Africa, but was then called Orange Free State. His mother and father had left England when his father had been promoted within the bank he worked for to head a local office in Orange Free State. Tolkien had a sibling 2 years younger than him. One childhood event that may have later made it into his stories was being bitten by a baboon spider in the garden. He was also, maybe kidnapped is a strong word, but taken from his family by a servant, although he was returned the next morning, and it's really hard to find anything else about that event. When he was 3, a temporary visit to England with his mother and brother turned permanent when his father died of rheumatic fever shortly before joining them in England. After this tragedy, the family went to live with Tolkien's maternal grandparents in Birmingham. The family moved many times throughout the English countryside, places like Sarrowell Mill and Moseley Bog, which were clear inspirations for the Shire. His Aunt Jane's farm was named Bag End, in case anyone was wondering how direct his life parallels were to the story. Tolkien was homeschooled along with his brother by his mother, and while he was an excellent pupil in all subjects, his mother awoke in him, through botany, a great love of plants and trees. He loved to draw landscapes and later did a lot of his own early illustrations for his work. But his true passion was language, which he developed as his mother taught him the basics of Latin. Tolkien's mother joined the Roman Catholic Church in 1900, which caused her Baptist family to cease all financial assistance to the family. In 1904, she died of acute diabetes at 34 years old, which was fairly old for a person to live with diabetes before the invention of insulin. She had, before her death, made arrangements for her friend, Father Francis Xavier Morgan, to take her and her sons and raise them as Catholics. Tolkien continued to study languages, and even invented some of his own along with his cousins. It was around this time, with Tolkien at 16 years old, that he met Edith Mary Brett, when Tolkien and his brother moved into the boarding house where she lived. She was 3 years older than him, but it was not long before they fell in love. Father Morgan did not approve of the relationship and prohibited Tolkien from any and all contact with Edith until he was 21 years old. Tolkien only tried to contact her one time, and after Father Morgan threatened to remove him from university, Tolkien respected the prohibition. On exactly his 21st birthday, Tolkien wrote to Edith and asked her to marry him. Edith had already accepted a proposal by another man, but upon receiving Tolkien's letter and declaration that he had never stopped loving her, she broke off the engagement. After Edith converted to Catholicism, the family friend she had been staying with told her to leave. This was unfortunate, but the two were soon married. After spending 2 more years studying, Tolkien was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the summer of 1915. The two were parted less temporarily when Tolkien was sent to France to fight. Tolkien fought in the Battle of the Somme, among other battles and smaller skirmishes, but this was the beginning of a number of health problems he began to have, starting with trench fever, a disease carried by lice. He spent time after that on the home front as a logistics officer. This is the time he started working on the Book of Lost Tales and the Fall of Gondolin. After the war, he began working for the Oxford English Dictionary. He then worked as reader in English language at University of Leeds when he produced A Middle English Vocabulary and a definitive edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight with a friend. He translated a number of other works during his time that would not be published until after his death. He was promoted to a professor, though after 1 year he returned to Oxford, where he held several different posts over many years. He also founded a society with other professors who doubled as writers called the Inklings, most notably his good friend and fellow acclaimed author C.S. Lewis. During his time at Leeds and early time at Oxford, he started a translation of Beowulf, and although the translation was not seen until his son Christopher edited and published it in 2014, his series of lectures completely changed the academic consensus on the work. He continued to work in language, specifically looking at epic poetry in Middle and Old English, which brought him to the Volsung Saga and other famous works, of which he added extremely valuable insight and context in similar ways to his work on Beowulf. Sometime while at Pembroke College, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, originally to entertain his children. He originally did not think to publish it, but after much success, his publishers asked for a sequel. He wrote the first 2 volumes of Lord of the Rings in this time, finishing the series much later in 1948. So that's Tolkien, a brilliant philologist who understood Old Norse as well as any academic of the day, Old and Middle English better than just about anyone ever, Old Icelandic, Gothic, as well as other early Germanic philologies, and medieval Welsh. He understood Latin well and had working, if imperfect, knowledge of most modern Germanic languages from German to Finnish. He created Middle-earth, which is itself lifted from Midgard, or how the Old Norse referred to earth in the context of the realms of their mythology. In that language, it just means Middle Earth. When he wrote the languages of Middle-earth, he wrote the languages. He invented multiple fully functional languages for his world. The publisher used Tolkien's own cover art and maps, although they omitted his illustrations. The calligraphy we so often see attached to Lord of the Rings, and most notably inscribed upon the One Ring, is Tolkien's own. Though he considered himself an amateur, his artwork was compiled in 1995 as a book, even beyond Lord of the Rings. So now that we understand Tolkien and his influences, let's talk about one of the greatest influences of his work, the Volsung Saga, or more accurately, its most acclaimed hero, Sigurd of the Volsungs. Tolkien was a fan of language, and in his career he gained a unique depth in his understanding of the epic poetry from Old and Middle English, various Germanic languages, and he used that understanding to craft the greatest fantasy series ever written. Keep in mind there are different versions of these stories. I am giving a very rough approximation of the story with elements from the Volsung Saga, the Poetic and Prose Edda, although there are versions of the story and attestations of the characters found in a number of other sources. Let's start with Book 1 of the Volsung Saga, which does not include Sigurd. It begins in King Volsung's hall with the marriage of his daughter Signy to Sigurd, king of the Goths. The god Odin arrives in disguise and drives a magic sword into a tree trunk, itself a gift to the king from Odin previously. It's all very sword in the stone, and though many try to remove it, only Volsung's son, Sigmund, is able. Sigurd is thoroughly upset by this, so he invites Volsung to visit him and his daughter, and kills him. The king's children are killed by a wolf in captivity, except Sigmund, who escapes. With the help of Signy's son, Sinfjotli, Sigmund kills Sigurd and burns down his hall. Some more family drama ensues after Sigmund marries Borghild. Sinfjotli kills Borghild's brother. Borghild poisons Sinfjotli. Sigmund turns her out, marries Hjordis, then dies in battle. Now the story doesn't end there because Hjordis was pregnant. She goes to live in the hall of King Elf of Denmark. On to Book 2. Hjordis gives birth to Sigurd. Sigurd is raised largely by Regin. And this is where we start to see important fantastical elements directly in the story of Sigurd. His father Sigmund wielded the magic sword Odin left in the tree until he died, when Odin shattered the magic sword on the battlefield. Hjordis gathered all of the shards from the battlefield and kept them. Sigurd grows up to be a classic superhero. Impossibly strong, brave, good-looking. King Elf allows him to choose any horse he likes from the herds of semi-wild horses in the area. At the suggestion of an old one-eyed man who is also definitely Odin, he drives the horse herd into a river, where only the strongest one chooses to cross the wild river and succeeds. That horse is Grani, descended from Sleipnir, the horse of Odin himself. Next, he'll need a sword. His tutor and surrogate father figure, Regin, is also somewhat of a blacksmith. He's also a dwarf, which is glossed over. Regin urges him to kill the dragon Fafnir, and sets to work forging him a sword capable of slaying a dragon. He buried the lead for a hot minute too, because we find out Fafnir is actually a shape-shifting dwarf who has more or less permanently taken on dragon form to protect a treasure hoard Regin views as his. So Regin is risking the life of his surrogate son to steal back the treasure from, once again a buried lead, his brother Fafnir, and by the way, the treasure is famously cursed. If you're interested in a bit more depth about the cursed treasure of Andvari and Andvari's ring, which was Tolkien's basis for the One Ring, I have a video up about it on my Patreon. Please subscribe. Anyway, Sigurd is somehow okay with all of this. Regin fails his first 2 tries making a worthy sword before Sigurd brings the pieces of his father's sword from Odin. Regin forges the sword, referred to most commonly as Gram, but also called Balmung, Nothung, or Wrath. Sigurd sets up for the task of killing a very dangerous magical dragon. Fafnir cannot fly, and is described as snake-like. He breathes or spits poison, that much is not completely clear, and his armor-like skin is difficult to penetrate even by magic sword. Sometimes Regin is involved in the strategy, sometimes it's entirely his instruction, sometimes Sigurd thinks it up, but the killing of Sigurd is consistent throughout all versions. He digs a trench on one of Fafnir's typical walkways, hides in it with his sword, and as Fafnir comes by over him, he stabs up and kills him. Fafnir gives a death speech about how the treasure will curse Sigurd and be the death of him. Then he gets his close-up and dies very dramatically. Regin wants to eat the heart of Fafnir. Pretty brutal way to treat your dead brother, but I'm just sipping tea. Apparently, eating it would give him the ultimate wisdom, or maybe just the ability to understand and speak to birds, or maybe to read the hearts of men. It's all version dependent. Whatever the case, as Sigurd is dutifully roasting the heart for his surrogate father, tutor, and mentor, he licks the grease off his finger and gains the wisdom or ability to understand and maybe talk to birds. The birds clue him in to the fact that Regin is going to murder him so he can steal the treasure and I assume basically swim in it like Scrooge McDuck. Sigurd kills Regin and claims the treasure. Yay, we did it. Now the cursed treasure will ruin his life. Oh. And it is, of course, at this time that a woman enters the story. In some versions, the birds tell Sigurd he should go find Brynhild. In other versions, he just happens upon a fiery blaze on the slopes of Hindfell while on his way home. In both versions, she is inside this fiery blaze that keeps wusses from waking her from her magical sleep. You see, she wasn't actually a woman. Brynhild was a Valkyrie of Odin, an immortal shield maiden who chose worthy heroes from among the slain in battle to join Odin in Valhalla, and to fight for him when Ragnarok came. She was doing well within Odin's corporate structure until she could not toe the company line on the slaying of a brave young man whose death she could not make sense of, and she refused to bring his soul to Valhalla. Odin fired her, and in their exit meeting, he recognized her long and valuable service by putting her inside magical flames that would only admit the greatest and bravest of all heroes who would be worthy of her. He made her mortal, but put her into suspended animation so she wouldn't age while she waited for her hero to be born and age into a non-problematic age gap. Upon jumping through the fire on Grani, his horse so awesome it is unafraid of magical flames, he meets the sleeping Brynhild. She wakes, because prophecy, and they decide to get married because Hollywood moves fast like that. He gives her an engagement ring, specifically Andvari's ring from the cursed treasure, and we, the audience, know they are now both screwed. Now, the rest is kind of a blur of tragic romance and comedy of errors that isn't remotely funny. There is a witch named Grimhild who either uses a potion to make him forget Brynhild, or a potion to fall in love with Grimhild's daughter Gudrun. Either way, he marries Gudrun and sets off to acquire Brynhild for Gudrun's brother, Gunnar. It all reads like a telenovela, and even after Sigurd and Brynhild die tragically, the cursed treasure continues to ruin the lives of everyone in this big messed up family. At some point in the future, a wise king returns the treasure to Andvari. The ring is lost forever, but having gotten rid of the treasure, the king and his descendants are freed from the curse. If we look at the elements of this story, we can find a lot of common ground with Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. First off, we see in both Sigurd and Aragorn that their story requires context involving their lineage. Sigurd's grandfather is given a tree by Odin. This is paralleled in the White Tree of Gondor, descended of the White Tree of Numenor, given to the men of Numenor by the godlike Valar from across the sea. There are multiple close calls, but the White Tree is saved by Aragorn's ancestor, Isildur. Next, let's look at the sword in the tree. It's a magic sword from Odin. Sigmund, King Arthur's it out of the stone and later becomes king. Then it is shattered by Odin as Sigmund falls in battle. It is reforged by a dwarven master blacksmith, Regin. This sword's echo is another great symbol of the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. It's the sword of Elendil, Narsil. This sword was forged by the dwarven master blacksmith Telkar of Novgorod in ages past. Elendil is Isildur's father, and Isildur kept the shards. Isildur dies tragically, and the shards later make their way to Elrond in Rivendell. Elf of Denmark took in Sigurd as a surrogate father. Elrond, who is an elf, took in Aragorn as a surrogate father. The sword itself is reforged into Anduril for Aragorn. Sigurd falls in love with Brynhild, a shield maiden and immortal who turns mortal and begins aging for him. Sigurd ends up marrying Gudrun, who ends up having a similarly tragic arc to Brynhild. Aragorn falls in love with Arwen, an immortal who turns mortal for him, with the added bonus that Éowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan, falls in love with Aragorn, though it is unrequited. The love lives of Éowyn and Arwen are much less tragic, with Aragorn and Arwen marrying and Éowyn finding love with Faramir, compared with the misery of Gudrun and Brynhild. Even Aragorn's help of Frodo with the One Ring, which is often referred to directly as a curse on Aragorn's lineage through the name Isildur's Bane, is a very similar arc to the return of Andvari's treasure to end the curse. Aragorn is not the only character or arc that has influence from Sigurd either. In The Hobbit, we see a dragon guarding a treasure hoard much like Fafnir. Fafnir is vulnerable only on his underside. Smaug has a small, bare patch vulnerable on his underbelly, and that is how they both die. Sigurd is warned by birds that Regin plans to kill him after Sigurd kills Fafnir. Sigurd later becomes a king. Bard the Guardsman, who becomes King of Dale after the events of the story, slays Smaug on the warning he gets from a bird, through Bilbo. Thorin Oakenshield, himself a king, speaks to the same group of talking birds, using them to relay messages and scout. When we start to go into the deeper lore of the series, like in the book The Silmarillion, we see even more deliberate connection to Sigurd and Fafnir. Glaurung is, essentially, Fafnir in Tolkien's world. The first of the dragons, he lacked the ability to fly. but he did speak and pronounce curses just like Fafnir. Glaurung takes a treasure hoard to guard and sleeps on it after taking Nargothrond. He was even killed the exact same way, via digging a pit and waiting for the dragon to pass by so as to stab up into the vulnerable belly by a doomed mortal hero. He then issued a curse against his killer, just like Fafnir did. Turin, the hero who kills him, was in possession of a magic sword and had an even more bleak, doomed romance with a woman who turned out to be his sister. The sword, originally called Anglakel, was given the name Gurthang by Turin when he had it reforged, again much like Sigurd's Gram. It's also not an accident that the name Gurthang sounds like a combination of Gram and its other names Balmung and Nothung. The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were the birth of high fantasy, a nearly meaningless distinction from normal fantasy, invented just to be able to refer to what J.R.R. Tolkien did. Never before had such a fleshed-out world with its own stories and lore been presented. Never had a story been so epic. And the reason for that is the immense inspiration Tolkien drew from his favorite epics. The story of Sigurd in the Volsung Saga is amazing for its time. It captured imaginations and was retold for centuries and centuries. Tolkien deconstructed what made it truly great, and he distilled it, along with other works, into the high fantasy genre. Other high fantasy series followed. Other high fantasy series have been great. But Tolkien's Middle-earth is unique, amazing, and the best that it has ever been done. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and let me know in the comments. If you didn't like it, or had some critiques or criticism, let me know that too. If you really liked this video, consider joining my Patreon, where I do more casual examinations into fantasy books, chapter readings, and other content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back for my next video. Tolkien's doomed hero, Beowulf.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away at break of day, to find our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, its flaming spread. The trees like torches blazed with light.